behind these questions and behind these responses later in the presentation. Typically, I'd rather have some discussion along the way, but given that this is a webinar, I understand we can't do that. But please do have questions. There is a ton of data here. We go into all kinds of issues that you guys are facing across the country. So happy to delve into any of these specific areas. There's also some data that we just probably don't have time to show. So I'm happy to really cover anything you might want to ask about. I also head up our political work. I've been doing a lot of work on the presidential race. So if you have any questions on that too, we can really take it in any direction you'd like. But let me give you a quick breakdown on what we actually did here, what you're going to see. We pulled 1,000 registered voters, and these are basically the opinion elite. These are your members and prospects that you're trying to target every day in your individual states. So they were all C-level executives. These are all decision makers on whether they join a chamber or not. As you see the breakdown between the size of the companies, we talked about doing it a little bit less than 25, but we figured that this was a good spot between 50 and up. And then as you can see, the breakdown on revenue, these are mostly mid-sized companies. And from what the council said, these are the most likely prospects and members that you guys see every day. So these really are representative of your members. And you'll see we have the data broken down by geographic region. We couldn't do individual states because it just wouldn't be valid data. But when we group them by region, you can actually see some differences between those in the South and those out West, or those in the Midwest and those in the East. So I'll leave it here just so you can get a quick idea of where you guys are in your individual states. And we did 250 responses per region. Every state was represented, and they were weighted within the region, so one state wasn't dominating the region, you know, a Florida or a Texas or a California. We tried to weight it appropriately, so no state was more represented than another. So I'll go through the top takeaways first. And as I said, we'll go into the detail, and I'll show you why we have why these top takeaways are so important. And this actually confirms from what I've gathered, a lot of research that you guys have on the individual level, is that you have a very good reputation. State chambers are seen as problem solvers, and that you really are valued by your members. So congratulations on building such a good reputation in your individual states. The key word that I want you to focus on, and you'll see this later in the presentation, is opportunity. I know a lot of folks in a lot of chambers talk about benefits and talk about intelligence or insights. When you look at what they actually want the most out of your chamber, it's an opportunity. And that's a word you should really focus on, because it can be applied to so many different things. It can be applied to networking, partnerships, growth, advocacy, whatever kind of benefits you're going to be offering. If you describe it as an opportunity, that's really a word that does resonate. Number 3, what are their priorities? Well, not surprisingly, the economy and anything related to the economy is their number one priority. When we're talking about business owners and decision makers, that's not a surprise. What was a surprise is security. That actually tracks with what we've seen in voter responses, particularly over the last couple of months with Paris and San Bernardino. But it was a bit surprising to see how high of a priority it was for business leaders as well. I know on the state level, you guys face social issues, particularly in capitals as legislative sessions have gotten underway. But those issues, when you ask directly of your members and prospects, what do they care about? What keeps them up at night? Social issues is not a very high priority when it's compared to other issues like the economy, like healthcare and some others. Number 4, if we had to boil down what you should really say your mission is, and this is a quote that you should really try and use, is that my state chamber or our state chamber creates economic opportunities and good paying jobs for everyone. That's really the nutshell quote that describes what you, and it really does resonate and makes an impactful response for your audience. So we'll come back to that as well. Another one, when it comes to taxes, obviously businesses are always concerned with taxes. Tax incentives and a simple tax code really do you mean a friendly business climate? That is almost the deciding factor when it comes to what makes for a friendly business climate or a hostile business climate. And I don't think I have this one in here, but 3/4 of your members and those that we polled said that they actually thought that their state was a friendly business climate. So overwhelmingly, a positive outlook on where things stand. Education. You absolutely have the credibility to lead on education, and obviously it's a big priority for you as far as getting an educated workforce. One thing that you should look to, though, is there's a big emphasis on trade schools, on trade and vocational education. In past research, we've actually looked at this topic for a governor in particular, who's made this a very big priority in his state. And the phrase that we actually came up with for him was not vocational schools or trade schools or technical schools. The phrase that you should look at in this particular area is career-oriented job training. People want careers. Jobs are like 9 to 5. You punch in, you punch out, you go home, you don't worry about it until the next day. A career is something that people value, and it's much more long-term. It's much more of a part of them. So if you look at career-oriented job training, it really does capture everything positive about vocational schools, technical schools, trade schools. Number 7, our respondents overwhelmingly oppose government mandates. And whenever you see anything in quotation marks, that's been tested in the actual survey. But they don't like mandates that are controlling. They don't like government mandates and government control. But if you ask them individually whether they support or oppose individual mandates, individual requirements, like minimum wage, like predictive scheduling, they overwhelmingly support those. It's a contradiction that you may see in your own individual states. It was one that jumped out at us the moment we got this data back. So very interesting, and we'll go through those specifics as well. A lot of you guys have minimum wage battles at the state level. If you are fighting those fights, the best way to fight it is to not talk about the minimum wage. If you can, turn it into a federal issue and talk about expanding the earned income tax credit. Or as we've actually done a lot of research, renaming it would actually be better if it was called a working family credit. And we'll get into this later as well. When you have a minimum wage fight, you have to come back with some kind of positive solution. You simply can't say we're opposed to the minimum wage. You actually have to have an alternative to make a credible argument, and this is the best one that we found. On policy arguments, they will fail if you're arguing on policy. If you're arguing about, even the impact on businesses is a bit too policy-oriented. What you want to talk about is how your arguments can improve people, improve your employees, improve and help small businesses. You have to personalize these policy arguments, because if you get stuck in the weeds talking about this policy versus that policy, you're bound to lose. You've seen folks on the other side who are talking about minimum wage increases, who are talking about mandates for leave and maternity benefits and everything else. The way that they win those battles typically is to personalize the consequences of not having them. So you need to actually fight on the same ground to have a chance if you are going to fight these, and use personal language and personal arguments. That's what will prevail. What will not prevail and what will lose every single time is if you go in with overheated partisan rhetoric. It turns off a lot of people. It certainly turns off any kind of swing voter, moderate public officials. We've seen it lose time and time again. It's great in a primary. We see it on the Republican side right now. We see Senator Clinton and Senator Sanders who can out-progressive each other right now. That kind of stuff is great in that environment. But when you're talking about individual arguments on, with a lawmaker on Capitol Hill in your state, or giving a speech, or giving an interview, if you really overdo the rhetoric, you're just digging yourself a big hole. So I'll show you a little bit of that too. All right, so let's just dive into some of these. This is if you want to do a screenshot, that's fine. And Bill, if you wanted to share this presentation, certainly that's up to you. But these are a few words that we've found to be the most effective way to communicate a positive pro-business language lexicon. So things like a healthy economy. I'll just pick on a couple of these. A healthy economy, we hear people talk about a strong economy, a booming economy. That's what Governor Rauner ran on last year in Illinois. Others talking about strong economic growth. We've tested all of those, and the best, most impactful way to communicate your positive message of building a stronger economy is that to actually say we want a healthy economy. And the word healthy can actually be used for virtually anything, whether it's healthy schools, healthy communities, healthy environment. The word healthy is actually very, very positive. So that's one that I definitely recommend you use. Also looking at common sense. This is something that people find to be lacking in virtually every state capital across the country, and certainly here in Washington. If you talk about common sense solutions, you automatically, and let me actually back up. These kinds of phrases here, these kinds of word choices, these are not silver bullets. What we try and do is actually take each of these and look at them as like a brick in a wall, that if not one of them by themselves is actually going to win you any arguments, but if you piece these together, you build a credible argument and you build your credibility brick by brick or phrase by phrase. So something like common sense, when you say, look, we need common sense solutions in Sacramento, it not only actually has a nice rhythm to it, it's what voters actually want. And if you're talking about bringing common sense solutions, they're much more likely to actually listen to what that solution is. That's the opposite of a very partisan attack. You know, we need conservative solutions or we need progressive solutions. That politicizes things. Every voter, whether on the left, right, or middle, wants something that's common sense. So I definitely recommend that one to you as well. And then at the very bottom, we put together two of them, opportunity and then all Americans everywhere. And you can use your own state as well, all Georgians everywhere, all New Yorkers everywhere. But if you actually use that phrase together where you're talking about everyone or all people or all employees, too many people try and segment into groups where they talk about the poor or they talk about the middle class or they talk about seniors, whatever it might be. That hyphenated kind of language actually turns voters or turns audiences off, because if they're not in that group, they don't think you're talking to them. So if you talk about everyone everywhere, you're being very inclusive. And again, it's just building your credibility little by little. So just a couple of slides on how overwhelming that support is and that favorability is for you. 82-4. I mean, we see this kind of measurement on like Pope Francis or Mother Teresa. So you guys have really done a great job in building your credibility across the country. What are they looking for? They're looking for networking. They're looking for business development tips and strategies. A bit lower is advocacy and anything related to kind of legislation. But their most valuable benefits that they get through you guys is actually what can help the bottom line, what can help build their business. And that's where the word opportunity, I think, comes into comes into play in so many ways, is because you can see how across the board it is a winner, both from the West Coast to the East Coast. You provide leadership and opportunities, and the opportunities, again, that kind of language or that kind of word can be applied to really pretty much anything that you're offering. Another way to look at it, we've tested this word opportunity, and we put it up against, in this case, free economy, economic freedom, free enterprise, and opportunity economy. And you're welcome to steal this. The House GOP actually picked this up last year. But it's that kind of thing that people are really looking for. They're looking for opportunities. Here's a word comparison that we did. And this was not from your survey. And you'll see me pulling in some other survey research, and I'll try and note what is yours and what is not. This was from a different survey that we did. But we tried to take something like Hillary Clinton, where she taught, and this is a very powerful statement. No one who works an honest job in America should have to live in poverty. People who grow our food especially should not be on food stamps just to feed their family. If you put that towards something positive, where you talk about Americans are really struggling, you acknowledge that struggle, but then you focus on common sense solutions that create real jobs and real opportunities for all Americans everywhere, This even wins among Democrats when you go head-to-head with Hillary Clinton's best language. So just to give you a flavor of how this type of language can be pieced together. So overall, very positive economic outlook. I don't know if I'd be quite this happy, but very positive, certainly compared to where the economy has been. Overwhelmingly positive that it has improved over the past 4 years. 80 to 8 is overwhelming. A healthier economy, this is where that phrase can, and I'll show you this, I have a couple of these where I can show you how these phrases can, again, not be a silver bullet, but if you talk about building a better business climate in your state, this is from a different survey, when we compared those two together, overwhelmingly, the response for healthier economy, just a much more positive, much more impactful way to describe what your ultimate goal is as a state chamber. So what do these folks really focus on? Well, when we gave them 5 issues and 5 big buckets, economic, national security, personal issues, government issues, social issues, you can see how they break down from one geographic location to the next. They're fairly consistent. The only outlier really would be social issues out west, which actually isn't a surprise when you think about things like assisted suicide, which has been on the West Coast for a long, long time. Many more environmental and ballot initiatives in California. The West seems to have a long history of being forerunners to the rest of the states dealing with these issues. So not a huge surprise to see that be so important in the West. But very consistent across, the top issue being economic issues. When you ask about economic issues in particular, we drilled down to each of those buckets. And again, there's that word economic opportunity and good paying jobs for everyone. Again, a clear winner. This was no contest here. Clear winner across the board. And that's where that phrase can actually come in handy as your foundational mission. As a state chamber, you want to create economic opportunity and good paying jobs for everyone. That really does encompass what you do, and you can pivot from that to really anything, whether it is taxes, whether it is mandates, whether it is benefits. That's a great foundation to work from. Some of the other things that you look at, minimum wage, and I'll show you why minimum wage is so interesting, because when you ask about it in isolation, it's an overwhelming winner. Most people want to increase the minimum wage. However, when you actually put it in comparison to other priorities, it loses a ton of its impact. And we've seen this in many other studies, especially in the federal level. But it does lose a lot of its intensity when there are other priorities that you put up against it. Reducing the deficit and national debt certainly doesn't happen at the state level, but you can see where everything else breaks down. Taxes are obviously a top-tier issue as well. The other bucket that we asked about, or one of the other ones, was personal issues. And so we tried to create these buckets so they included similar type of priorities. Here was education, healthcare, welfare. We put roads and highways and transportation, college, universal child care. You see paid maternity and parental leave. Another thing that is very significant and overwhelmingly supported when it's by itself, but if you put it in competition to other priorities, it really does fall to the bottom. Healthcare will be an issue, obviously, for business owners and anyone running a business because it is such an anchor on your bottom line. So not a surprise to see that be a top-tier issue. Government issues. Those are issues of corruption and accountability, waste, bureaucracy, that sort of thing. Making government more efficient and effective. I've streamlined this a little bit from what you saw, Bill, in Marco Island. But one of the most efficient or effective phrases, not to use the same words, but we have found that works over and over again, no matter what the context, is that if you're on the side of making government more efficient, more effective, and more accountable, that's the magic phrase. That's one of those phrases that works on the left, it works on the right, and it works with independents, because everyone wants government to be accountable. Everyone wants government to be effective at what it does, and everyone wants it to be efficient. So that's the kind of phrase that if you do have those battles in your capital about good government, that's a phrase that you should put in your hip pocket and use. Social issues. This was gun violence, the environment, drugs, same-sex marriage, religious freedom. Again, look at those issues that are toward the bottom. These are ones that you've seen on ballot initiatives. You've seen them in capitals across the country. These are issues I know that you have to face in your capitals, but if you ask business owners and business executives what keeps them up at night, those aren't the ones that keep them up at night. So keeping our streets safe, gun rights and gun control and gun violence, obviously with the news in the last, couple of years with all these shootings, that does keep folks awake. And those are high priorities, as you can see. So which of the following do you believe should be your state's highest priority? And this is when it comes to education. That phrase at the top, prepare every student for college, career, and life, that's another one of those phrases that we've tested again and again. We've done a ton of education work. That's one that if you do have an education battle, if you're on the side of reform that prepares every student for college, career, and life, that is a phrase that works with parents, it works with teachers, it works with administrators, it works with public officials. You name it, it's a phrase that you should copy down and use in any legislative battle that you have. I also wanted to point to, this is where that career-oriented job training language can come into play. We gave respondents a bunch of different choices, and as you can see, a lot of these sound pretty similar. Worker training programs, long-term strategy for community college and trade schools. If we had to boil it down, this is where I talked about replacing those three on the right with the one on the left. We've tested it, we've researched it, we've refined it, and that's the phrase that you should really try and replace. It'll take discipline because these other things have been around for so long. They're ingrained into our vernacular, but the language on the left is one that we have found that resonates much, much better than the ones on the right. So let's get into some of these mandates. This is where we asked about, just generally, do you think that there are too many or too few state government employer mandates related to business? Not surprisingly, there are lots of folks who say there are just too many mandates. I'd like to meet the 7% who think there are too few. But when you ask them specifically what kind of mandates they oppose the most, this gets into just a word or phrase you can use: government controlling companies' business practices. That's a word, when you hear the word control, so many people think that they lack control in their lives or lack control in their businesses, whether it's government telling them what to do, whether it's the stock market going up and down and they have no control over that, whether it's healthcare prices and costs going up exponentially year after year. They have a feeling of not being in control. And consumers feel the same thing. Gas prices are whipping above $4 and now below $2. We just have very little control over, a lot of important things in our lives, and business owners and business executives think that as well. So if you can actually talk about mandates as being government control, that kind of word and phrase resonates very powerfully. But when you get into some of these individual questions, like minimum wage, do you support or oppose increasing your state's minimum wage? It was very consistent. These folks are okay with mandates if you're asking about them in isolation. So here's minimum wage, 80 to 8. When we looked at what is an alternative, expanding the earned income tax credit, that was a clear winner. The others that didn't fare so well, as you can see, exemptions to a minimum wage for certain industries, workforce programs. But when you put the minimum wage versus the EITC directly, even Democrats, they are the only ones that actually have a favorable view of just increasing the minimum wage. The other is about split. So it's a fair fight. And most folks don't even really know what the EITC is. You have to do some education. But if you go with an alternative, you can actually win on that issue. So here's the question about maternity and paternity leave. 72-9 for increasing maternity leave. Mandating paternity leave was 82-7. Again, overwhelming numbers, and all of these mandates in isolation have similar support. We broke it down by members of state chambers and non-members, and your members actually supported more so than non-members. We talked a little bit about this, and that might be because the non-members are more Tea Party, they're more on the right side of the issue, or of many issues. That could be the reason why, but your members overwhelmingly support both of those. When we asked about paid sick time and then time off for caring for family, again, very consistent, 73-16 and 83-5. That one might be the biggest spread on the right. So we asked some language questions. This was the clear winner when it talked about paid leave policy. This is from the National Partnership for Women and Families, and they do I wouldn't have changed anything about this statement. Nearly everyone will have to take away from work to deal with a serious personal or family illness or to care for a new child. Our nation's public policies are failing to meet the needs of workers and their families. Laws providing paid family and medical leave allow workers to meet their health and family needs without jeopardizing their economic security. Perfect language. We tested a couple of other things. We used some heated language that didn't really work. This was the one that really did. We also asked about predictive scheduling. Again, we had to do, this one was not quite as well known as raising the minimum wage. We had to do a little bit of setup. But even when you explain it, 78-11, again, an overwhelming winner. We asked about some of these. What would concern you the most when it comes to predictive scheduling? Not surprisingly, it's that it takes away the flexibility for employers as well as for employees. But as you can see, some of these other arguments, look at what's on the bottom. It's an undue intrusion by the government into business autonomy. Particularly out west, that argument just doesn't fly. That politicizes things. But if you're talking about people, you're talking about employees, much more personal. So what do these results all have in common? Well, quite frankly, they're all empathetic. If you ask about them in isolation, of course we want to take care of people who are caring for a loved one. Of course we want to give folks more benefits or more leave or more income. So when you ask about them like that and they interpret them like that, they aren't government regulations. They're talking more about personal protections. And that's why so often businesses actually don't win these arguments, is because they're fighting against government regulations. They're not fighting for personal protections. So what we'll try and do is actually give you a few helpful hints on how to actually combat these in your states. A couple things about healthcare, because this isn't going away as an issue either. But cost, that's absolutely the number one concern when it comes to healthcare. That's been very consistent not only with small business owners and executives, but with voters across the country. You can see it really is all about costs. And actually, this is from a survey we did last year about the Affordable Care Act, and we asked about state versus federal. And this was across the board. So this was not just Republicans and maybe independents thinking there was more, putting more faith in the state government than they do in the federal government. This was across the board. So we asked, between the state government and federal government, who would give you more control over your health care? State government, overwhelmingly. Everyone down the line, very consistent, just like with those mandate questions, very consistent in deference to the state. And that's why state solutions in your state capital can be so effective, certainly compared to Washington. So if you have an opportunity to run against Washington, definitely try and do that. I'll give you a quick example of that overheated language and how a different approach will work much, much better. This is language we came up with, and we compared it to the actual language of a congressman in opposition to the Affordable Care Act. And so what we said here was every American deserves health insurance, affordable, patient-centered insurance. That's not what the Affordable Care Act does, but it is what we're committed to delivering. efficient, effective, and accountable public programs to provide a secure safety net, strong, vibrant marketplace to provide the freedom and choice we all deserve. Almost every one of those phrases has been tested and proven over and over again. And look at what it beat out. Obamacare is a command and control regime that reduces families' choices, thwarts innovation, and charts a path of European-style debt and rationed access to health care. If we cave and set up an exchange, Obamacare is never going away. Even among, let me go back to the other one. Look at that GOP number there. 11% of GOP, 12 points ahead is this language here. We had a couple of other options. That's why the numbers don't add up to 100. But this was the top vote getter. This was the bottom one. And even with Republicans on the right who are loath to support Obamacare, language that's much more positive and talking about what you're for will resonate much, much greater when you're out there talking to lawmakers and to the public. So a few things on civil rights issue. This was another language exercise that we found. This really does capture where business executives and business owners are. Every person, regardless of their gender, race, religion, or sexual orientation, deserves equal opportunity and equal protection under the law. Period. No exceptions. This was a clear winner, and I put this first just because it really does summarize everything we asked about some of these race, religion, and sexual orientation questions. They do support religious freedom laws. We've seen this in Indiana. We've seen this in other states, in Arizona. It's come up in North Carolina. So we asked them point blank, do you support or oppose these types of laws in your state where a business has the option to not serve someone or not work for a customer that they choose not to? And yes, they do support it. We even put a different variable in there, and we asked, would you support or oppose that same religious freedom bill if it gave other religions the ability to discriminate against Christians? And it was less support, but still a majority supported it. So there was some consistency there. So the bottom line really is that you need to advocate for solutions that create opportunity, that talk about good paying jobs and careers. Don't forget about that word careers, because that's what people really do want. And if you're talking about jobs, that's great, but add in careers as well, and you're just going to build more and more credibility. You have a bunch of policy fights on the horizon. I'm sure many of them are underway now in states that are in session. You need to talk about both the benefits and the consequences, not on policy grounds, but on personal grounds. That doesn't mean that if there are some economic statistics or some stats and facts and figures about your business that can actually make your case, use them, but don't use them exclusively. Lead with personal, secondarily with policy, and you have a good argument. And then last but not least, I know a lot of these battles can get very political very quickly, but if you're the one throwing bombs, if you're the one out there with really harsh language, you're just digging yourself a hole and making it even harder for you to win. So if you use personal language that is positive where you can, acknowledges a problem up front, even if you're opposed to what they're trying to do, that's the way that you can actually build credibility and gain support for your position. So with that, Bill, why don't I turn it back over to you, and hopefully we have some questions.
Thank you, David. So anybody can go ahead and ask the question through the question panel or the chat panel. Even if you just want to kind of note that you have a question, I'll try to individually unmute you if you want to speak. One thing I would like to point out is that this slide presentation and the full survey data will all be made available on the Wikipedia webpage, and there'll be links to that data in next week's newsletter, as well as the recording of this webinar will also be made available. We have one question from Amy Hilter. She asks, does quality of life still resonate?
Quality of life I think so. I mean, particularly when it comes to healthcare, that's something that we've found definitely resonates. You're not just talking about cost, but people are obviously concerned with quality of life. So I would say that in that context, that phrase certainly works. I'm not sure if you had another context in mind. I don't know if you can unmute her, Bill, but if there's another context in mind, I probably have to kind of hear it to weigh in on it specifically.
1 second, I'll attempt to. Oh, she doesn't have a mic, so.
Okay.
One other question that actually came up earlier when you were discussing the minimum wage issues, Don Boyd was wondering, when you're talking about raising the minimum wage to the surveyor, does that mean that they are worried about raising it, or they actually want to see it raised?
No, they actually support raising it. If you go back to, let me see if I can go back to that slide. Where is it here? I think it was the first one I had up. No, we've seen this in, here it is. Do you support or oppose an increase to your state's minimum wage? So that's where it's undeniable that they support the increase. When we asked it a different way, maybe some interpreted it as we're worried about it being raised. But my guess is they're actually looking at raising it as a priority rather than being concerned about it being raised. And again, we've actually looked at this issue a number of different ways. We've done focus groups on it as part of policy discussions. And this is universal. I mean, if you're fighting against a minimum wage increase, you're fighting an uphill battle because most Americans, even most Republicans, are okay with raising the minimum wage. Again, where you might find some comfort if you are opposing it in your state, it's how big of a priority is it against other priorities? Most folks think there are bigger priorities. Creating more jobs rather than raising the minimum wage is a priority that most everyone agrees with. So when you put it up against other issues, you can find other alternatives and other things to focus on. But in isolation, and you ask about minimum wage, it's definitely a winner.
Here's a good question from Tom Schumann, Indiana. He asks, talk about the word compromise. Is it effective to point out that the unwillingness to compromise is detrimental to the policy process?
It's a great question, great word to zero in on, because compromise actually is a bad word. It might be great in practice, but the word itself is not one that you need to use. There are some alternatives that you can use because most people want their policymakers to compromise. Okay, they want them to work together. But if you use the word compromise, you're going to raise some concerns mostly on the right and on the left, at least the far right and the far left. They don't want compromise. Okay, most people on the fringes don't want compromise because they automatically think you're compromising your principles. That's not what elected officials want to be compromising about. The phrases to actually use are coming together, finding common ground, cooperation, and if you string it all together, you actually say we need to work together, we need to cooperate on common sense solutions. Those kinds of words get to what people actually want. They want the parties working together to get something done. The word compromise just has a little bit more baggage that we found, and we typically recommend not using it.
Here's one more from Blake Wilson in Mississippi. He asks, are there any differences between modern economy companies versus traditional companies?
Great question. We didn't actually break it down that way in this survey, but there are absolutely different priorities for those types of companies. And you can actually look, in this survey, you could look toward where those companies are typically located. So there were lots of differences between companies in the Midwest, which are typically, your manufacturing companies, or at least they're much more prevalent in the Midwest, versus companies maybe out in the West. Issues like career-oriented job training, issues like taxes, cost of living, those sorts of things were much higher priorities in states that are more traditionally manufacturing states or traditional industry. Issues out west, like we saw with social issues, like we see with the environment, some of the other issues in those buckets, those were much more of a higher priority in the West, and that's where you'll find more technology companies, more innovative companies. At least they'd be more represented there. So we've seen some of those breakdowns, but we had to look at them geographically rather than industry in this particular survey.
Getting a few more in here. Dave Atkinson in Kentucky asks, he says that you mentioned the favorable impression of state chambers, but his sales folks sometimes find that some business leaders don't even recognize what a state chamber is. Did you run into that during the survey?
No, we didn't ask, have you ever heard of it, or do you know what they do? We asked if they had a favorable opinion, and we asked what they get out of it. My guess is if there are folks who don't know what the state chamber is, it's probably going to be on a smaller company. We did see that there were more for companies that were on the smaller side, 25 and under, 10 and under with employees. They were obviously more attuned to their local chambers rather than their state chambers. So my guess is that's where the education could be most effective if you were reaching out to those types of companies or those sized companies. But that's about as far as we got in the survey asking that particular question.
Yeah, even sometimes business owners get a little bit confused. What is the state chamber and their local chamber, and even the U.S. chamber, because there's a lot of chambers being thrown around. Here's a question. Did you notice a difference in the minimum wage support based on company size?
That is a good question, and off the top of my head, I don't recall. But that is one. Why don't I do this, Bill? Why don't I actually go back into the data and look that up, and I can send you an answer.
Excellent. And I'll include that in the newsletter next week.
Okay. And so that was, let me just make sure I get this. That was minimum wage support by
based
companies. Okay. Got it.
Here's
Cool.
a question from Tom. He says, thoughts on this education phrase, equal opportunity for quality education and success in school for every child is the most important social justice and economic issue of our time. Okay, so he's putting one out there, and he's wondering your thoughts on that. I can repeat it.
Okay. Yeah, there's that. Well, that's certainly a big one. That puts a lot of priorities into one phrase. I'd probably say a lot of those words work individually. We hear a lot of people talk about quality education. We actually have tested that particular word, and no one wants quality education. They actually want an effective education. So when I mentioned before the word effective being used in many different contexts, that's one where it is used it's a very powerful way to describe education. Another way is just to say excellent education. Quality can be good quality or bad quality or average, but if you have something that's a bit more subjective and talks about it in a positive way, either effective or excellent, that's one. Equality is another word. Yes, you can talk about equality, but it's better to not use the word equality. It's better to actually spell it out, because equality has been politicized as a word. Social justice has been politicized as a word. If you want to reach the broadest possible audience, you don't want to use words that have been politicized. So one way that I would say, and we've tested this, is to say that every student deserves an effective education no matter what their zip code is, no matter where they live, no matter their household income. Every single student deserves an effective education. That doesn't get into anything about policy or anything about politics or justice, but that doesn't make any exceptions for any student to be left behind. So there are ways that you can say these, get to the same end, but to describe them in a way that's a bit more impactful.
Here's one that I know we didn't ask in this specific survey, but you might have run across it in other surveys. Kate asks, is there a difference between using the terms plaintiff attorney versus trial attorney?
Definitely. Anytime you can say trial attorney, anytime you can say personal injury trial attorney, actually lawyer is probably best. Lawyer is better than attorney. Anytime you can say the word trial, lawyer together is much better than plaintiffs. Plaintiffs is more innocuous, and this goes back certainly for quite a while. But yeah, any way you can shoehorn in trial lawyer, you're definitely winning.
And here's a follow-up to that one. Is there a difference between extreme environmentalists and anti-growth groups?
Anti-what?
Growth groups.
Anti-growth groups. We haven't really gotten into that one. Generally, if you're talking about special interests, and they can be environmental special interests, they can be corporate special interests, we found that that resonates more if you can describe them more as special interests, no matter who you're talking about. Because if you get too specific and talk about them being environmental extremists, again, that's politicizing. That's using language that is partisan. But if you talk about special interests, no one likes special interests. So even if they're environmental special interests, that's going to be better than using the word extreme.
Here's something to keep in mind for our next survey, and it's a good point from Zach Hutchins. He says it would be interesting to see the stats on quote-unquote state chamber support in states like his, New York, where his state chamber is actually called the Business Council of New York State. And he's not the only one. There's, a good amount of what we consider state chambers are called by something different in that particular state. And sometimes it will be a little bit confusing what your state chamber is, even for people living in that state. So that's just something to keep in mind when we're talking about state chambers.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I would hope, though, that in the states that actually use a different name, like a state council or jobs council or business council, that has more resonance in those particular states. Obviously, if it's not used somewhere, you don't want to change it, but hopefully if it's used with a lot of prevalence, it can actually have a bit more impact in those states.
Here's another comment from Kentucky. They were surprised by the importance of networking. State chambers often leave that to the local chambers and don't think of networking as a major benefit. So it's a good insight for them. And then
there was actually another question. I think just for length and time, I didn't include it in this one, but networking, it's not just going to events and going to cocktail parties. We kind of got the sense that they looked at networking as a way to build their business. So it was networking with potential partners. It was networking with, joint ventures. It was networking with customers. It was networking with experts who can actually help them with problems that they face. So it was much broader than just kind of a meet and greet. We looked at it as that's a definite strategy and a definite way and benefit that they see the state chambers providing them a way to impact their business and grow their business.
And here's another one from Kentucky. They ask about something that I'm sure has been pulled to death, Common Core language, the use of higher standards, better quality education, etc. Do you have any insight on that particular policy battle and messaging?
Oh, yeah. We've done a ton of work on that particular issue. We've actually done a lot on education. Common Core, the name has been so poisoned that if you are anywhere near Common Core, particularly on the right, you're going to lose. However, if you are talking about standards, and even if you talk about national standards, there's overwhelming support for it. So people like the concept. They support the concept. They don't support the implementation or the name. So there's definitely a contradiction there. But everyone wants standards. Everyone wants local and state standards. No one wants federal standards. But when you do ask and drill down about national standards, they actually do think that people in Massachusetts and Mississippi should be learning the same stuff. People from California and Connecticut should be learning the same material. So they want their cake and eating it, and they want to eat it too. But anything related to Common Core has just been poisoned beyond being salvageable.
Yeah, and I know a lot of these state chambers are quite familiar with that battle. Here's another from Barry Robinson, and you touched on this a little bit with the state versus federal trust polling, but he asks if with favorability towards Congress, was there any data gathered on confidence in state government versus federal government, and as far as having any effect on the economy?
I'm not sure about the effect on the economy, but the trust and faith really does resonate on the state level versus the federal level across the board. And we didn't stack the deck. I mean, this wasn't a way that we said, do you trust state lawmakers versus Washington politicians? I mean, that would be a completely skewed question. We said, do you trust politicians in your state capital or in the national capital? I can't remember exactly what the phrasing was, but it was apples to apples. And it was very consistent with what you saw in those healthcare options. Overwhelmingly supportive of their state lawmakers. That's not to say that there aren't the same problems, but they just don't think that things are as bad in their state capital as they do in the national capital. I'm sure if you look at, Albany or Sacramento or Tallahassee or some of these state capitals, things can be quite as bad, but they balance their budgets. They're much closer to the people. The reputation they have is just far higher than it is for folks that go to Washington. And that really does cross party lines and crosses whatever issue you're talking about, whether it's healthcare or energy or education.
Here's one from Kurt Bauer in Wisconsin. He says, per the special interest comment that was just made, what should we refer to ourselves as?
Well, not special interests. Obviously, now, if you can talk about representing small business owners or representing job creators, and use numbers. If you have 20,000 members, use that number. Say we represent 20,000 job creators in this state. Someone else is going to describe you in not so flattering terms, but if the more that you can talk about how many people you represent and who they are in particular. We represent 2,000, 3,000 businesses, 10,000 businesses, and they're 21 million employees, if you're in a big state, or there's 6 million employees. Breaking out those numbers so you're talking about how wide and deep your membership is, and if you can, talk about, be as specific as you can. This obviously can't go on like a bumper sticker, but instead of just saying we represent businesses, talk about what kind of businesses you represent. We represent 5,000 businesses, from manufacturing to technology to energy to healthcare. Something like that. The more descriptive you can be, the better you'll actually make your case. And we've seen that in many other surveys where people refer to stakeholders. It's just so generic and so cliche. The better alternative is to talk about and specifically identify who those stakeholders are. So in healthcare, instead of talking about stakeholders of care providers, say doctors, nurses, and pharmacies. Instead of manufacturing, just saying we represent manufacturers, say we represent those who make plastics or metals, or be as specific as you can. That will make your argument and your pitch that much stronger.
Here's one from Blake Wilson in Mississippi, and I'm not sure if you'll have any specific data on this, but maybe you'll have kind of some insight. He asked if you've polled anything on the impact of Americans for Prosperity, which is an active group in a lot of these states.
Well, I'm not sure what he means by polled them. And AFP is big in pretty much every state, but we haven't polled anything about them. They're politically active. They can certainly mobilize grassroots, but no, we haven't polled anything about them.
Okay, here's one last one from Tom in Indiana. He's asking for any suggestions that you might have as far as successfully educating their talented policy advocates on his team who are very used to using policy arguments. And in many ways, cases, do you have any, words at work? Or, I mean, obviously we've talked about that, but do you have any general suggestions as far as how best for them to go about training messaging?
Yeah. Well, it's one of the hardest things to actually do effectively because policy folks deal in policy, so therefore their language is going to be policy. It's like asking, an attorney not to talk in legalese. So it just takes a lot of discipline and really having a toolkit that you can pull from. And that's where some of these words and phrases that I highlighted today can be effective. And I'd actually just put the offer out there for anyone who wants to connect directly. Just reach out to Bill and he can just do an intro. I'd be happy to talk with anybody about doing one of these calls, not just on this survey, but we have so much other data from focus groups, from other surveys, from past work examples where we've actually worked with trade associations, the Business Roundtable, the U.S. Chamber, individual companies asking about the economy, coming up with language on minimum wage, on mandates. I mean, we've done a ton of work and actually have ready language that you can use. So we'd be happy to connect with anyone offline if you'd like to talk about, doing a training session of some sort.
Yeah, certainly reach out to me and I'll introduce you to David and get that connection made. Don Boyd has another question. He asks, do you have any recommendations for words to use other than reform, such as tort reform or reforming certain laws?
Yeah, that's a great question because reform is one of those words that is so empty at this point. It's so hollow. There are sometimes when there isn't anything else to use. But instead of saying education reform, talk about improving schools. Instead of talking about healthcare reform, talk about improving patient health or improving access. The word improvement is the phrase or the word that we found is most effective to replace reform because reform can be good or bad. Particularly when it came to health reform, it can be good or bad, but when you actually say that you want to improve something or strengthen something or expand something, use an active word that denotes something positive and something better than just change. Because change can either be good or bad. When you tell someone that you're for effective education, they know that you're actually focusing on improving education, not simply just reforming it. So I'd say those are a few words that I would recommend and that we've certainly used and seen to great effect in the past.
Here's another one on word advice. Are there any words that help with messaging as far as going against Tabor laws?
I don't know what those kind of laws are. Do you?
Bill of Rights, like they have in Colorado.
Oh, gotcha. Well, we haven't done any research on that issue in particular. We've done a lot on taxes in general. And when you talk about the consequences, that's certainly one way to look at it, that if you're fighting a taxpayer bill of rights that could hurt your business, if you talk about the word consequences, that's certainly one way I would start. Another is to talk about if it's a tax battle. Most folks, when we polled about taxes, they're less concerned about a taxpayer bill of rights, and they're more concerned about simplifying taxes. That's one. Now, we're not talking like flat tax and postcard tax returns, but simplifying the tax code is a word, making it actually, I'll give you 4 words. These are 4 words that we've proven in a bunch of different surveys on taxes. People want a tax code that's fair and consistent. Those are the top 2. Simple and straightforward. So those and my guess would be that a taxpayer Bill of Rights might get to being the fairness aspect, but it probably wouldn't simplify it. It probably wouldn't make it more straightforward, and probably wouldn't make it more consistent. So if you're looking to fight that in your state, fighting with simplification, being straightforward, and being consistent would be where I would come out. But again, that's one of those things where we've done a lot of this kind of research in the past and can actually do new research if you have a specific state battle that we can help with.
One more. There's a Barry's clarifying his original question about the state versus federal. He says, let me ask a little differently. Many states seem to be doing well, but there is a cloud over D.C. that remains and seems to have an effect on business overall. Did you hear anything along those lines?
There's definitely, you definitely put your finger on it, that people are much more optimistic about their state and local economies than they are about the national economy. A lot of what we do is asking about not just how they feel today, but where they think things are going tomorrow. And there is a big split between being optimistic about the future when you ask them about the country versus asking about their families, themselves, their business, their career, their kids. If you ask it, the closer you get to people, the more optimistic they are, particularly on the Democratic side. This is what's so interesting, and this gets back to, I think, the national politics. Republicans think the country's going to hell, and they ascribe all of responsibility to Barack Obama. So when you ask about America and the United States or the national government or national economy, they immediately define it as in a political way. But if you ask them about their state, if you ask them about their family, if you ask about their local economy, that is not, kind of clouded by their feelings for the president, and they give you a much more positive outlook. So that's pretty consistent, and I'm sure if you look back at data from 2006, Democrats would be much more pessimistic on the national level with George W. Bush as president than they were looking at their own state and local economies. So that's something that is fairly cyclical, and I think will change if a Republican's president next year. You'll probably see that change pretty quickly.
Well, I think we finally exhausted the questioning, and wait, one more clarification from Blake. He says, "What is the best language to counter Americans for Prosperity stands against economic development?" So I guess more generally, are there any language that would help going against a far right kind of group?
Yeah. Hard to say. I mean, there are so many different battles in so many different states. I know in some states it's over energy, in other states it's over taxes and spending. So I'd say it's hard to pinpoint, a particular phrase or strategy. I think I would actually just say using those language strategies that I talked about, no matter if you're battling someone on the left or right, if you take the middle ground and you talk about the impact on voters or employees or businesses or small business owners, or if you're getting more specific on nurses or on teachers or something like that, if you talk about personal consequences or personal benefits of a change or of a policy, you're simply going to build more support for your argument rather than trying to take someone's knees out with something that's, much more partisan or much more polarizing. So I know there might be a desire to want to take on somebody on the far left or the far right and get into a brawl. But when you do that, you become part of the political problem. You become a mudslinger. You want to try as much as possible stay above the fray and have your arguments focus on how you actually can help people or businesses or families. You're going to find that your arguments resonate much more so if you're arguing from that position rather than trying to, hit somebody in the mouth with a partisan fight.
And one thing, could you flip back?
Let me also add one last thing, Bill. That doesn't mean that I don't have experience doing that. I worked for Newt Gingrich for a long time. We worked with a lot of political organizations, and there are sometimes when you have to do that. But when you're talking about some of these issues that businesses and the business community needs to push or push back against, that language it's appropriate for other instances. It usually doesn't work when you're in that kind of fight in a state capitol, where there's lots of media attention, where you're giving interviews, you're doing sit downs, you're talking to the Rotary Club, that kind of stuff. Those aren't where you have those partisan fights and ad wars and things like that. That's kind of that's where I'm coming from when it comes to those issues.
Yeah. And one request, could you quickly flip back to the first two main slides with the overview? And again, these slides, as well as the full survey data and a recording of this webinar, will all be made available. I know that people attending here probably want to flip through these slides in a little bit more detail and take some notes, as well as anybody that was not able to attend today will have a chance to listen to this. So I think this has been a fantastic webinar. The information you provided, David, has been excellent, both in Marco and here. And I know we're going to be doing some follow-up with you. And this great Q&A that we've got going here has really helped, I think, shape where we want to go with this on the next installment of this. So thank you so much, David. It's been really helpful for all of us, and we appreciate you taking the time to go over all of this with us.
You bet. No, it's been great to work with you guys. And again, the offer's open if you want to connect offline on anything specific to your state. We do a lot of state-based work. We've been in. I was in Alaska just last month working on a state issue there. So we do a lot of work that's based strictly on what you need in your state, and we can tailor that kind of work. So reach out through Bill, and I'd be happy to chat with you.
Yeah, and if anybody doesn't have my contact info, my email is bkramer@multistate.com. That's BKRAMER@MULTISTATE.com. So bkramer@multistate. Go ahead and reach out to me, and I'll either introduce you to David or send you the slides or whatever you need. So thank you, everybody, and have a good afternoon and a great weekend.